Hey guys, Languagehacker here. Week 3 is just concluded, so I wanted to make the video, explain to you guys why I brought Warlock to week 3 and Specialist, why I brought the 3 specific deck lists that I did, talk about my tech choices, my thought process, and how my practice sort of went. So, quick overview, we ended up bringing Control Warlock. It's a little trimmed down in the main list, and as you can see, I labeled each of these decks primary, secondary, tertiary as per the specialist stuff, and in brackets I put in a sort of description of what the tech choices are alluding towards. So generally in your primary, in a deck like this, you might want something a bit more of a standard list, i.e. What you see on ladder, cascadings, Yashraj, and all that stuff. But I think with the expectation in Specialist that the feel is going to be mainly either Priest or Tempo decks, I think the matchup is good enough against Priest that you can trim it out a little bit, some of the top end, and try to make sure that you don't insta-lose game 1 to some of the more aggressive Tempo decks, i.e. Rogue, Mage. Even though Mage isn't technically an aggro deck, it's in the style of they try to kill you sort of deck. Hunter, which I didn't expect, and I'd probably still lose to Hunter, but still it's a little better against Hunter, and Warrior, which ended up being a bit more popular near the end of testing this week, for at least from ladder and MTQ stats and whatnot. So basically the plan was, instead of having the standard list in the primary, we decided to go for a more not completely full anti-aggro, but a little more anti-aggressive, with enough cards similar to the normal standard list that we could board out into the secondary into the classic 30 card list, or close to 30 card list that we see on ladder. And that's where we kind of settle on this. We still have the armor vendors that we want, jailers. I'm going to go over everything that's normal, standard. Drain Soul, Sheer, Hysteria, Hoarder, School Spirit, blah, 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 blah. Basically, the only cards that aren't standard that we included here were Demonic Studies, 2 of them, 2 copies of Morg, and Kazakis. And normally what you see in this list is the 2 Cascading Disasters, the 2 Strongmen, and Yashraj. And those are the 5 cards that we board into for the secondary when we try to be a bit greedier, i.e. if we hit Priest or the Mirror or something like that. But in the primary, we have 2 Studies, 2 Morgs, and Kazakis. Now, Cascading is much, much worse against Rogue. It's pretty bad against Mage. It's still solid against Warrior, but I think with the restriction of only having 3 decks available, you can't really make a deck for everything. So I wanted to kind of bundle the primary deck to still be decent against the greedy matchups, which is pretty much just Priest or the Mirror, which I didn't really expect anyone else to bring the Mirror, while having a good shot against most of the Tempo decks. And then if we need to, we can board out to a different anti-specific list if we need that, or we just stick to this list against aggro. Now, you might ask, why are we playing Demonic Studies? Well, let's look at the Demon Pool. Flame Up, pretty good in Tempo matchup. Jailer, we run that card. Dark Lair, 2/3 with some upside, not great but acceptable. Scrap Imp, that's not bad. This can be used sometimes. Midway Maniac, defensive minion, just another 3/2. Mosher, pretty good as a stat line, and you can heal off of it in some instances. Void Terror, 3/4, pretty solid. Fire Breather, AoE. Body's not great, but still useful. Defensive Taunt against Tempo decks. Immediate board reaction. Greedy late game option. Acceptable Tempo option, but not great. We run this in our deck. We don't normally pick this, but still, if we need a big boy in some matchups, we can take it. Defensive option. We run this in our deck. Very defensive option for late game. Also defensive option. And that's the Demon Pool. There's some neutral ones that are poop, like this is poop. Now we can actually type Demon and take a look at them. Poop, pretty good. We actually run this, and I'll explain why we run this. Pretty poop. Defensive. Not great. Very minute cases. There's a few cases where this works out, but not great. Acceptable removal against tempo decks. and then 12-12. So the Demon Pool is really, really good in terms of just tempo, with some late game options as well if you need it. And that's why I wanted to include Demonic Studies, because the flexibility of it helping out, it helps you curve out. If you miss a 1-drop, you can try to hit a Jailer or a Flame Imp. If it's a very aggressive tempo matchup, you can find a 2-drop to play on 2. And you can also Studies on 1 and play a 3-mana Demon on 2 because of the discount, which means you can play Void Terror, Manari Mosher, stuff like that. So it lets you curve out much more aggressively against those tempo decks, which is why we include Demonic Studies. Moarg, why is Moarg in the deck? Well, let's think about it. Rogue's not really running Backstab. They're running Brain Freeze and Wicked Stab. Do they really want to Wicked Stab a Moarg? Not really. So if you drop this on 2, it just contests board. Warrior, no damaging spells whatsoever. It just contests board. Hunter has some, but again, if they're quick-shotting your Moarg, you're kind of okay with that. So it's decent on curve, and against the burn matchups, you can also save it past a certain point. Let's say you don't want to tempo this on turn 4 or 5 when you draw it. You could save it to use with Drain Soul and Tamsin for Giga Healing late game. That might be not happening in every game because you do need to have your one of Tamsin and the Moargs and the Drain Souls, but it can happen in enough games. And even just being able to go Moarg Drain Soul to deal 6 damage to minions, or Moarg Soul Shear, even Moarg School Spirits in some matchups ended up being quite useful, at least in testing. So that's why the Moarg's in there. Tempo, some healing option, and more efficient removal against the aggressive decks. Okay, next up, Kazakus. So this is the last card. Now, because we're cutting Yasharj and Strongmen, because they end up being very slow against these tempo matchups we're trying to beat, why are we then running 2 Cascadings? Feels kind of weird. So after testing, Kazakus ended up being pretty fine. Some people actually tested Kazakus, not just me. This isn't a new, sort of development. People have been running Kazakus in Warlock for a little bit, but I think most people kind of settled on Cascading as the better, more standard card. But Kazakus, again, if you're going for a very tempo game plan, Kazakus is probably a bit better than Cascading. You ship it on 4, you get some good 5s. Nice. It's a bit of flexibility as well. Obviously, you can go for 10 mana golems if it's a slow matchup. So even though you're missing your charge and stuff like that, you can still get some late game value with this deck. But ultimately, the plan was to make it better against the aggressive tempo decks that could be brought this week in Specialist, because I was comfortable enough with how good it was against Priest. All right, secondary, I won't talk about this one too much. The changes that were made are -2 studies, Demonic Studies, -2 Morgs, and minus Kazakus to put in Yasharj, double Strongman, double Cascading. This is pretty much the standard list. An important thing to note, I'm running 2 Drinkers, 1 Ogre in the primary and secondary. I think people used to be running double Ogremancer, and I myself was running double Ogremancer in prior weeks of GM, I believe. But I ended up deciding that Void Drinker is probably just better against everything but Mage. Priests are usually only running 1 death, so the Void Drinker is pretty likely to stick. Warrior has trouble getting through that because they don't have hard removal. Mage is devolving, but I mean, if they don't have the devolving, it doesn't die to a Pexus Blast, and it can contest the second half of the blast that comes out. So Void Drinker ended up being pretty nice. I still wanted an Ogremancer in there just for a decent number of 5s to be able to corrupt the Cascadings. But everything else about this list is pretty standard. Nothing too crazy here. And now the tertiary, which I have put in brackets Lamau. We have cut 2 Morg Artificers. We have cut... you know what? I'm going to have to double check. Oh, no, I know. We have cut 2 Morg Artificers. We have cut 2 Nethers. And I believe we cut the Siphon Soul. Those are the 5 cuts from the primary. And we've added 2 Altar Fires, an Ogremancer, and 2 Robes of Protection. So, you might ask, why are we running these cards in our deck? Well, against Rogue, Warrior, probably Hunter, and Paladin, the primary kind of handles all of those classes. Now, it may be a little bit weaker based on some tech choices against some of those options versus the other ones, weighted based on what I think people are going to bring. But this pretty much deals with all of the tempo decks. This, I'm not queuing into tempo decks. And this list isn't particularly great against Mage. And even against Demon Hunter, there's not a lot of stuff to put there. Demon Hunter is an incredibly risky bring this week because of the prevalence of what people expected. Priest to be quite prevalent. And because of that and Mind Render, bringing Demon Hunter is kind of suicide. However, you know, I'm a crazy idiot bringing Warlocks. So maybe someone else in there bringing Demon Hunter. So because I'm comfortable with my other two decks covering pretty much every matchup, I committed this list to Demon Hunter, but also Mage. So in testing, Robes of Protection ended up being really good against Demon Hunter because they struggle to get I-Beams out of hand, throw glaives, and whatnot, which means it screws up their Skull Outcasts, and it just prevents them from killing the board unless they have Moargs. Either Moarg Immolation or Arcanist Immolation. So sticking with a game plan of curving out with 1-drops into 2-drops, maybe with the Demonic Studies, and then 3s, and then like your Giga 5s, this gives you a way to beat Demon Hunter. It's not consistent, it's not likely, but this still gives you 20 to 30% against Demon Hunter, which is much higher than what the matchup normally is. We tested Vol'jin. Vol'jin was just not good enough. Sometimes you hit them with a Ticketus, but more often you're just playing a 6-mana 8/8 because it's just so unlikely you can... it's so unlikely you get the exact Sociologist into Ticketus payoff to actually get the mill. Now, the final option were the Altar Fires. Now, there weren't really great tech cards we could put in. There's other shitty 2-drops or 1-drops or 3-drops we can put in, but none of them really have as much of an impact as Altar Fire. So Altar Fire is just a Hail Mary. You know, if we happen to hit Il'gynoth, maybe some Moargs from their deck, cool, they're gone. This also happens to hit Mage a decent amount of the time. And you might say, well, you know, Languagehacker, they were in Devolving Missiles. That just goes through the Robes of Protection. Well, they have 2 Robes of Protection, and they have 2 Devolving Missiles, and we have 2 Robes of Protection, 2 Ogremancers, and 2 Void Drinkers. So most of the time, we're going to have at least 2 to 3 of these cards, and they're going to have 1 Devolving on average. And eventually, as the game goes on, we'll get more of our threats, even if they do happen to draw the second Devolving. So this ends up being pretty solid against Mage too. Mage is still rough, but the primary and secondary will not do very well against Mage based on how it's built. There are some chances to steal a game away if you can control the board, not get overwhelmed, and then fall back on more Drain Souls, but that doesn't happen in practice that often, so I feel like a proactive approach is much better, which is why I wanted to have this tertiary specifically for those 2 decks. And when you get to late game scenarios, you can also use Altar Fire to burn remaining cards in the deck. You'll notice in a lot of my games on broadcast against Nalgadon No Hands Gamer, there were cases where they were low on cards in hand and they just had a few cards left in deck. And at that point, if I have reads on what their cards in hand are, I can ship the Altar Fires and try to burn the last 3 cards if I know there's like a Fireball in there. And that can kind of close out the game. But realistically, against Mage, it's more often used as a way to proc either Counterspell or Netherwind Portal. Because most of your other removal you don't really want to use to proc that, because A, it's expensive, and B, you want to use the Drain Soul and Soul Shield to actually remove and heal instead of proccing Counterspell. So Altar Fire is a good way to play around ring toss stuff. So I ended up top 8, very close sets against Nalgadon in the top 8 match, so I couldn't quite get top 4. But honestly, if you've seen some of the games, I've been getting pretty unlucky in Grandmasters week after week. And I know I complain a lot, but it's been rough. Regardless, I'm still pretty happy. I think the Bring was good. There have been some rough matchups, but ultimately I think this was, even though a riskier Bring, I think it was teched very nicely against what the expected meta was going to be. And even though Priest was underbrought, which means that my chances of winning the tournament go down significantly because I can't farm Priest for free, even though I did get fled twice in groups, which was nice, and fled brought Priest, I still think this was a pretty solid Bring compared to what the field ended up being. So I'm happy with my choice, happy with the top 8. We still get some points. If we top 8 every week, then we will still make top 8 in playoffs, and that'll be great. We're on track-ish for that, but I would really love to get a nice little top 4 or top 2 to help close out the top 8 by the end of the 6 weeks for playoffs. Anyways, hit the subscribe button. I'll be putting out videos like this every week, so if you guys are looking into insights, into lineup crafting and whatnot, it's a good idea to follow or subscribe to the channel. So like, comment, subscribe. See you guys next week.